James, I just wonder whether you can respond to the earlier issue and just give us a brief overview, and then we'll get stuck into Ian's paper.
Thank you, Chair. We've got a high degree of interaction with Napier City Council at the present time around water management issues. It's probably as strong a level of dialogue as councils have ever had. Napier City has had a recent series of E. coli incidents, and we get notification of those from Napier City as they happen. The most recent incidents appear to have been within the reticulation system and therefore not at source, not at the borehead, and therefore it hasn't been a consent compliance issue for us. It has been more about the state of their infrastructure. So we've let them get on and do the work around that. We've had close liaison over their water shortage issues. I've had several discussions with the Chief Executive and met with their Chief Engineer last week. So we're tracking those issues as well. We are part of the joint working group between Napier City Hastings councils on drinking water. So there's an ongoing dialogue between staff around the management of drinking water between the councils. And just with respect to Central Hawke's Bay, we're obviously continuing to monitor that consent, although dealing with the ammonia issues that they have and their inability therefore to meet their consent conditions is a case of them having to go to their community, part of their long-term plan, and raise significant sums to undertake capital investment which won't be completed quickly. So there's little we can do there. I'm satisfied that we've got the relationship with Napier City, the information that we need to monitor their consent activity. To do anything deeper in terms of us working with them on resolving the present issues that they have would require a change to the current focus of our compliance team. At the moment, as Sue outlined, they are responding to every pollution response or complaint we get, majority of which are in the air quality space. And they're also trying to meet their target of monitoring 90% of the resource consents that have been issued. If the council was of a mind to redirect some of that resource and wanted to see some more resource put into shadowing Napier City's consent issues, that would likely deviate from that current focus of the team. And I suggest that I am providing you with a report on the Ahuriri wastewater discharge issue later this week, and that we have a further discussion at that point in time as to whether or not there is further resource reallocation required around Napier City's infrastructure issues. At this point, I don't believe that there is a need to do so, but I do take the points raised by councillors which is that there is a risk that we get dragged into their issues, which are predominantly due to an underinvestment, long-term underinvestment in the quality of their infrastructure, and issues now coming home to roost.
Well, thank you, James. Councillor Bailey, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. James, I'm pleased to see that you're going to report him back to us very shortly on the sewage discharge. Because you've got this really close relationship going with Napier City Council on this particular issue, one of the things that's been getting under my skin about their response to the issue is that any time the public have raised the question of the water bottling plants, is they have been very, very quick to respond by saying that it's our fault for issuing the consents for the water bottling plants. Can you point out to Mr. Jack that the Napier City Council issued the consents for building for the conversion of the buildings over there, so it's also their responsibility, and they were also responsible for actively promoting the water bottling plants coming into the area. It really gets under my skin that we're carrying the can for that one.
Councillor Belford.
Is your report going to be available for the Wednesday meeting?
Yes, it will, for our pre-meet at 9 o'clock on Wednesday is the planned time for that discussion. It does relate in part to staff, so it is a conversation I would like to have confidentially with the councillors in the first instance.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on that topic before we start on the land management? I do have one, and James, I really would like to see additional resource introduced on a short-term basis to examine the consenting and compliance arrangements for both wastewater and drinking water in Napier City, so that we've got a third separated and virtually independent view of what the consent requirements are, what the compliance issues are, and what are the restraints and issues around our current, if you like, that 60 to 90 day period. What are the constraints on us to essentially be all over these issues? So if you feel as though you can manage that within existing resources, good on you, but I have heard the counter argument today that they're not there, and I think there's another imperative, and that's to give assurance to the public that we have eyes on this issue and that we are focused on a better outcome than we've had. Ian.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Maori Council. Look, I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing the topic. There's a brief cover note and a paper attached. Just to introduce Christina Robb, though, who has run the review for us. Christina's going to run through a presentation in same format as Sue and go straight into questions. Christina's obviously had a significant involvement in these sorts of challenges through her professional career, so was well placed to help us. And it's been quite a revealing exercise. And we have dovetailed them together because they are, as you've seen from Sue's presentation, somewhat interaligned, and so it was helpful to have them considered together. So I'll just hand over to Christina.
Kia ora, and thank you for the opportunity. I want to explain the title. What does it mean? Integrated Delivery of Freshwater Outcomes. And I left Environment Canterbury 18 months ago, and I've been working since then with 7 other regional councils, and I'm seeing a trend, if you like, for more and more of them to start discussing, yes, we've had the last 6 years of developing rules and plans, but what are we going to do now in terms of getting action underway, plantings, wetlands, sediment control, all those things. So it's a very consistent thing that I'm seeing across councils. It's kind of the new area for discussion, and so it was welcome the opportunity to have a look at this in a Hawke's Bay context. So my work was to develop a set of recommendations for consideration, focusing on actions and delivery that accelerate progress towards freshwater outcomes. So it was focused on freshwater, although I do make the point that it could be extended to other aspects of council activities. It was to look at integration internally and externally, and obviously starts to overlap with the work of the traditional activities of your land management team. They were the key focus of this. But also, and this whereas it dovetails well with Sue's, is to look at regulatory implementation within the context of wider action. It was looking at all parts of the region, not just the lowland but intensive areas, but also the hill country and the issues you've got there. But it was focused on rural, particularly sort of rural land use and farming, horticulture type issues. So that was the scope. I did a set of interviews with some of you and with some other external people. I had my own experience, and I had discussions with quite a few staff from across council, not just the land management team, and with the executive. So I've put that all in together into a set of recommendations. I've got 3 slides that summarise the themes from the interviews. So I heard strong support, not just from councils and Maori, but from everybody else, for a really strong partnership with Hawke's Bay Regional Council and Maori, and recognition that it's evolving. Another point that came up quite often was the need to bring in the district and the city councils. I don't need to go into that more, I don't think, with you, because of the discussion I've just been listening to, but to bring them in under the concept of partnership. I heard an appetite for acceleration across the region of the actions, not just concentrating on the Tuki and the tank catchments where you've got your statutory processes, but thinking about the whole region. And strong support for Hawke's Bay Regional Council galvanising action by others. So a strong recognition that it wasn't going to be council on its own that did this, but they wanted to see council, or everybody wanted to see council taking a spearhead. And it does give you a bit of a mixed message, I think. Sometimes they want other people to do it, but they don't want you to wait for them to build up capacity either. So you're in a bit of an interesting situation. I didn't hear any clear message of one single activity that will accelerate progress. Everybody has different views on that. Two of the things, the first two bullet points, I think, not necessarily surprised me, but I wasn't expecting them to be as strong as they were. There is huge support for work to happen at the community scale. Hapu, marae, schools, community halls, even pubs, you know, something at that scale at which the community engages, and a really strong desire to measure progress locally. So people were prepared to do something if they knew there was a measure that they would see quite quick feedback. And that came through really strongly, including mention of a Maori monitoring tool, which I know is something that Ian's looking at, but also the potential for people to do their own monitoring and have their own feedback loops. Not just rely on council state of environment monitoring. That came through strongly. Strong interest in an ongoing liaison role. You know, people in the tank are interested in what their roles will be on an ongoing basis. Potential to increase involvement of hapu and marae. The tangata whenua people I interviewed are quite focused at the moment in their mindset, I think, on the policy processes. In part, that's a capacity issue, but that acknowledgement that there was some projects and actions that could take place at the more local level was something that they supported. And then recognition of the importance of making one-on-one contact, particularly with farmers and growers in the first instance. This is the last one on the interviews. So there is a really high expectation on you as the environmental regulator. I think that's a thing that's happened everywhere through the National Policy Statement, and the need to enforce your rules. And again, the discussion you've just been having was evidence of that. There's a request to actively manage public expectations, particularly around the time frames that it might take to turn some water quality trends around, and the time that you might have to keep ongoing action going for. It's not a quick fix, overnight fix. There was support for farm environment management plans, and I think they're well entrenched now as the tool, both in a regulatory and a non-regulatory sense, and people are now starting to question about how robust they are, what's the quality assurance system in place around them, but I didn't hear anybody really questioning that they had a role. And there is some merit in enhancing internal alignment. The external people, I think, didn't see too much of an issue. Where they'd seen it, they thought you'd addressed it. But I guess definitely coming through from the staff, and again it was echoed in Sue's presentation about the need for internal alignment. Okay, so the recommendations for your consideration. Everything in my head that I've recommended sits under a partnership approach, so there's no specific recommendations around that. I think it's something that is acknowledged and has been behind some of the thinking. And I'm recommending establishing catchment manager roles, and maybe 3 to 5 in the region. The exact scale of them, I put some stuff in the report around a scale that was decided to be too big in Canterbury after a while of trialling it. And that person is there to manage and connect all actions and relationships in a sub-region or a breakdown of your region. I'm recommending that they have, each of those has a catchment advisory group where you bring in the tangata whenua and the district city councils, but also the environmental, primary sector and community leaders, and they would be meeting 2 to 3 times a year. This is not a tank ongoing heavy process, but a process of setting an annual work program, looking at the monitoring results and deciding where to go next year. Within each, I'm calling them sub-regions at the moment. You might come up with your own term, but I'm trying to come up with something that doesn't preempt you making another call. The areas would be prioritised for action at a community scale, and I've put some criteria in the paper around all the things you might use, including importance of the issue. Can you measure it? Is it something that other bits of the region would learn from? Is there a willing community, a local champion, all those kind of things? And again, just reiterating the point that came through from the interviews, the potential to look at things that are really important to local hapu and marae. This is Porirua Harbour, and they've done an exercise. They've split that harbour into about 30 sub-catchments, and then what they've done here is they've identified issues. And I think you can do that now, and I think lots of councils do that kind of thing. You can identify values. But what I don't see coming through, and I think inherent in what I'm suggesting, is this: so what do we do? What do we do? Is it planting? Is it, and what is the best thing to do first over the next 2 years, so that you've got across a sub-region quite a good view of what is the most important thing to do from a risk to values perspective. And I think people are looking to council, perhaps with other scientists helping you, or other advice and community advice and mātauranga advice on what do you do, what should we concentrate on. I'll come back to that a bit later on around some of the farm plan stuff. So I'll just go back to here. Sorry. I guess the other thing I'm saying is, in a catchment like, let's use Porirua because it's not here, we might do that, and we might know for 30 little sub-catchments, but I think we need to perhaps start picking 1 or 2 areas within that whole catchment and hitting them hard, and working one-on-one with the farmers in those sub-catchments, or the landowners, and addressing the issue that you identify as a priority. So it's a honing down, therefore you can provide a clear message to people as to what needs to happen, and you can measure it. Which goes to my first point on the next slide. Measuring and then making the data readily available to people so they can develop their own feedback loops. I think part of this concept of the council galvanising action by others, monitoring is really important in that, and their ability to set up an ongoing process where they've got their own feedback loops. I think that came through really strongly. It's involving others in leading delivery as much as possible. Now, there was lots of people commented to me about beef and lamb, and that they had a role, and that they were good, and they liked what they were doing, and they thought they should be really involved, and then they go and they've got one person in Hawke's Bay. So there's a bit of a expectation on others, but I don't see a huge amount of capacity necessarily coming through that's helping yet. And so this recommendation is about thinking about, maybe one of these sub-catchments you could almost give to beef and lamb to run, and they would have to do that. If it was decided it was going to be a fencing catchment, that's what they'd be doing. They wouldn't be sort of going back and looking at everything. But if you want them to play a role in the long term, it was almost this concept of giving them examples and letting them go on the stuff you'd like them to go on, and maybe even funding them. It might be under their own brand, but that concept's in there quite strongly. And the other one is starting with one-on-one contact, and I think this is particularly important for the teams, catchment teams, or what your land management teams evolve into, is that the initial contact with landowners or land managers is one-on-one in the first instance. I don't think that's sustainable in the long term, but I think people are very keen to understand on their farm, in the context of their farm, and in the context of the catchment that they're in, what they can do, what they should concentrate on. I know you're in LTP, so if there's additional funding, people had views on, and I've made some recommendations on, I think communities actually know what it would take to speed up freshwater outcomes. For some of them, it's access to monitoring equipment or advice. For some of them, access to labour, access to capital, access to trees. There's a whole suite of things. Some of them just want to put a funding application into a government body but want someone to do it for them. There is a whole suite of things that I think would accelerate progress, and my recommendation is that you make the funding as broad and as flexible as possible, but the accountability comes through. It must be tied up to doing the priority thing or the action that have been identified by your catchment advisory groups. Have a set of recommendations which dovetail, I think, well with Sue's. So while this review was kicked off through looking at the land management team and its activities, there's a whole lot of other activities within council that need to align: the communications, the IT systems, including a contact database, the science, the way the science goes into things, and then this this going back to the point that people made about having very strong expectations on council and its regulatory implementation. And I recommended entirely independently from Sue, but then we checked, the establishment of a regulatory implementation role. So someone who sits at a strategic level across the consents and compliance roles and links them up, can provide consistent advice on what the rules mean. You can get a lot of churn in councils, and this is by no means just you, where you have 6 or 7 meetings just to interpret a rule. We've got to somehow figure out how that doesn't become a black hole of effort, and I think someone in a strategic role that can make those calls would help. But if you establish that role, it needs to work really carefully with the catchment managers. You've got to connect the regulatory and the non-regulatory up at a reasonably senior level, I think, so they're all aligned up behind the same outcomes. Farm environment plans, keep the work you're doing on those. I've suggested that all the work, people have a strong expectation on quality assurance of them, both from the environmental sector wants to know that they're actually achieving outcomes, but also the farmers want to know that their investment in them is worth it and that they're doing the right things through them. So I think continue all the work that's happening under the regulatory implementation role around farm environment plans, and over time you would expect those plans to connect up to the catchment outcomes that you're doing through this process. And interestingly, that seems to align quite well with some stuff I've seen coming out of the tank around collectives. So I don't think this is out of kilter with what you're doing or what some of the farming groups are coming up with as a way they'd like to work. And the last recommendation is actively manage public expectations. I know that's hard. It has been hard over the last 6 months, but I guess the whole thing around how long it's going to take and what's achievable and trying to get some of the stories out there where things are working, I think is really important. So in summary, I've recommended approach for consideration and discussion. It's about local delivery of actions led by a catchment team sitting under an advisory group. And again, that sits under a partnership with Maori and other councils, which will be wider than water. It affects the activities of the land management team and wider. It does respond to, and it could respond to, an appetite for acceleration, depending on the funding and the resourcing that goes into it. It sits alongside regulatory implementation and has a potential, if the approach works, because you're working with local communities and you're engaging with them, to go beyond water and align, particularly with biodiversity and climate change. But over time, I think you could look at biosecurity and river engineering and a whole lot of those activities that you do that are outcome focused, that are out in the rural areas of your region. And I also think it could work in the urban areas, particularly when you're looking at stormwater, when you need a whole lot of people doing things. So it does have potential to expand. It would be my recommendation to focus first on freshwater and get that going, improve it, find out exactly how much resourcing it would take and the scale that you're going to work at, and knowing that you can extend it beyond that. And that is it.
the huge amount of work involved in that report, so we thank you for that. Inevitably there'll be some questions coming forward on this. I would reiterate though that we do have a second bite of this cherry on Wednesday, so whatever questions you can't get out on the table today, I'm sure we can make sure we do when this is passed on to Council for consideration then. So are there any questions around this paper? Councillor Belford.
I have a bunch of E-words floating around in my head. Enforcement, education, exhortation, economics, and I guess when you say that a lot of this has to do with answering the question on the ground for a specific farmer as to what do I do first, it seems to not be able to offer sort of, I don't know what the right term is, I'll call it economics, but to say to a farmer, you have a suite of things you're going to need to do here, but we know you want to pay for it somehow, and so we're going to tell you how to do that as well. We're going to suggest that you destock, or that we change your inputs, or we're going to, whatever makes sense for your particular, you're going to take some land out of pasture and put trees on it. So you're really talking about an advisory service, it seems to me. If it's going to be useful, and one that if it is going to be useful is going to have to help coach individual property owners as to how to optimize their financial return as well as their meeting their environmental benefits. So I was conscious that there didn't seem to be any discussion of that aspect in it, and so it does seem to me that this is blurring an enforcement responsibility we have in the first instance, primarily enforcement of farm plans. I don't like to call them environmental plans, they're farm plans, they should be. And on the other hand, there's a major advisory aspect to this as well. And a lot of conversations I hear, people don't like the blurring of those two things. They accept the council in its enforcement role. They're not so sure, and you make a comment somewhere in here about councilors telling farmers how to farm, that they're not as accepting of councils or council staff in that capacity. But this seems to be deliberately blurring those two together. Is that a fair comment, and what's your reaction to that?
I think that's why people prefer, in their minds, an organisation like Beef and Lamb ultimately taking the advisory role, because they understand that they will do health and safety, animal welfare, farm economics and environment. And you're right, I think that people expect the council to do the environment side of it. I wouldn't necessarily say enforcement, but to do the environmental advice. That is what people expect the council to know a lot about. And why I've focused in those recommendations on working in partnership with some of the other people who I think they do expect will take that broader advisory role.
Councillor Barker.
Could I pose a comment as a question similar to Councillor Belford, and say that, having read your paper, I thought what you were trying to tell us was that we have struggled with a number of environmental issues because it's been what the Commissioner of Environment said, the tragedy of the commons, there's no ownership. So what I've got from your paper is you're trying to give people some sense of responsibility for things, and rather than make people responsible for the lot, make it close to home so it's close to them and important to them. And the second thing you've stitched into this is, rather than have people be, we're the regulator over here, we do this and you don't do that, say that we're all responsible for this in somehow. In having smaller, more focused areas, you've then said it's easier for humans to do things if they can see measurable results and make measurable changes. So it's made it personalised, and so you have in some ways done this deliberately to bring about a change of behaviour in the people in the community, which is quite the opposite to what has been suggested by the previous question, which is we do this, you do that. Have I missed something here?
No, that's good. That's a good summary of what I think my recommendations say, but I don't want to downplay the importance of you doing your regulatory role well in that context.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm working at the moment with a irrigation scheme in Canterbury, and they've got farm environment management plans, they call them, because that's what the consent conditions say. And there's 17 objectives, you know, and what I want to do is go, okay, for the next 2 years, we're going to focus on getting you all to use your soil moisture measuring stuff properly, because that will, to me, will get action as opposed, and local, all those things that you say. But I think it's the ability to grasp something that needs to be done and get everyone kind of doing it, not giving them 17 sets of instructions, is sitting behind partly the way I see that. We call it, some people said this to me in the interview, and it's a term I like, the triaging at that catchment level around what you need to do and what you need to focus on.
Thank you, Councillor
We have
Wilson.
a role as a good regulator, absolutely. Just, I'm interested, perhaps through you to the Chief Executive, there was a piece of work done, I think in 2010, around how much we spent actually on instruction, i.e. regulation, on influencing and investing in outcomes. And let's be clear, we want better outcomes, right? I just wondered if that piece of work could be updated, perhaps how hard that could be, probably an internal desktop function for Ms Lambert to do on the 29th of December. But in seriousness, because it just seems to me that where we're going with the LTP, all those percentages will change somewhat, potentially. And we're all looking for better outcomes.
Sure. So, Councillor, I'm personally not aware of that report, haven't seen it previously, but we'll dig it out and have a look and come back to you with a view as to whether or not it can easily be updated and the merits of doing that. You know, look, absolutely, and we are looking at a significant expansion in the long-term plan, both of our regulatory functions, but also in the non-regulatory space. And so whether we've got the balance right is a judgment call for you to make in finalising the LTP over the coming months.
Mr Maori.
Yeah, I just very pleased to see that Māoridom was up in the early part of it, and within the Hawke's Bay region, we've got a dozen or so excellent examples of hapu marae type projects, and what Māori like to see is almost an instant result, and that's in the planting line. And I think we can build on that, because most of the places they would like to plant or see planted, they actually don't own the land. But it's probably council-owned land, and that's where most of these projects have gone. But you know, they're sort of ready and wanting to do it instantly, rather than be involved in the regulation and banging farmers on the head because they're not doing it properly. So you've got an enthusiastic group there that are ready to go, and there's government agencies that are there to assist them as well. So very good paper, thank you.
Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Christina, did I hear you say when you're going through those themes from the interviews that there was quite a strong agreement amongst people that you interviewed around the themes that you've pointed out here, the points that you've made? So there was pretty, everyone was...
I wouldn't say everyone, but if one or two people mentioned it, it sort of didn't raise itself as a theme. Oh, sorry. I wouldn't say everyone agrees with every theme, but it had to be, there had to be at least a third of the people before it was coming through as a theme.
Right, okay. No, that's fine.
No,
Because
Is there one you're questioning?
No, not so much questioning. I'm encouraged. I was becoming encouraged by the fact that that people sitting around this table and in other areas in the organisation are kind of in agreement on where we should be going. So, in fact, that was the theme that was coming through in those interviews. Just we may be going down slightly different paths, but at the end of the day, yeah. Yeah,
well, I would be comfortable with you saying that the themes are reflective of the overall interview feedback I got. Doesn't mean that every single individual agrees with every single theme, but I am very comfortable that they reflect an overall direction.
Thank you. Councillor Belford, did you have a final question here?
I have trouble distinguishing this as between a kind of a administrative apparatus versus an advisory service. And what I mean is, if I were to look at this as administrative apparatus, I would say, fine, we have a whole range of things we want farmers to do. And freshwater compliance is just one of those. There's biosecurity, there are pests, all sorts of other things that you allude to there. And so from that standpoint, I would be more comfortable if you were saying, okay, because we have to present ourselves to farmers in a variety of we want modes, that they all be included in that. That's where the administrative efficiency would be, sort of one-stop shopping. On the other hand, you haven't really presented it that way. You presented it as an advisory thing, telling them how to do stuff. And I'm not comfortable that that's where we belong. There's a wide range of expertise involved in being able to provide that. You mentioned beef and lamb and the full suite of things they could provide. Well, either we equip ourselves to provide that full suite, or we just write it off and say there are other entities out there better equipped to do it, and our job is to promote the growth of that capacity externally. And so whether this is an internal capacity or an external capacity, to me is still an open question.
The way I've thought about it, and I discussed this with Ian quite a bit, is that if you knew where in 10 years' time you would like the advisory capacity to sit, internally or externally, and my view is external, you can do stuff now if it's not there that kind of demonstrates and illustrates where you'd ultimately like that advisory capacity to go. I mean, it's not a choice now between not being in it or being out of it, I don't think, because I do think there's a capacity and possibly capability issue around the advisory capacity in the region. Not talking just council here, seems to me. So I don't know if it's an either or at the moment, because if you want to get going on freshwater outcomes, then some of this needs to happen now, and you can do it. Well, you can decide to do it. Versus waiting for that advisory capacity to build externally will probably just delay things 2 or 3 or 4 years. So I don't know that that's an either or, and I've been thinking about where you want to get to in 10 years and starting to demonstrate that, including maybe doing it yourself for a couple of years and passing it over.
Simple answer to that question. If you think we can go out and hire 5 advisors and bring them inside, well, we could create an entity and fund 5 advisors outside, couldn't we?
Look, thank you. Did you have a question, Debbie? Comment? Well, let's get to. We're running short of time, as we would utterly expect to today, and we've got tourism knocking at the door. We've got to get our bed numbers up. So I just want to go to the recommendations. Thank you, Christina, for that. I think you did very well in capturing the essence of where we want to head. But we're up to the recommendations, and I feel as though they need a little tweaking to make sure we capture some of the commentary we've had. And I just want to go to recommendation 2. Note that the Chief Executive will be taking the recommendations and advice of the reviews into account when considering the Council's structure an operating model going forward, and I'm wanting your view as to whether we could just add, make it a comma after forward and go including external capacity and partnerships.
I'd be happy to consider that if you take out the words going forward.
Yes, all right.
So I think it's possible the chief executive of this organisation go backward in time.
Yes, okay, we'll take going forward out. Good point, Councillor. So we're removing going forward and we're saying including external capacity and partnerships to capture some of the commentary earlier. Are people comfortable with a slight tweak to the recommendation there? Well, the report refers to that, and Councillor Belford has raised the spectre of internal-external, so we probably need the Chief Executive to consider that when he's coming back to us with his options.
It's only on the menu of options.
That's right.
Which it could be, you're putting it on the menu of options explicitly rather than leave it there by implication.
That's right.
You're adding nothing other than clarity.
That's precisely that, Councillor.
Well, if you want to move that, I'm happy to second that.
Okay. Secondly, Councillor, if in that vein, we'd had an earlier, because we've got two papers in consideration here, I wonder whether you'd be comfortable with the other outcome we discuss immediately after morning tea, and I'm thinking something like the CE, recommendation 4, the CE gives consideration to resources required to meet compliance challenges over the next 90-day period. Any thoughts, or leave it in abeyance? What do you think?
Personally, I think that's for a separate discussion. So we then have something that's rather pointed, that's, pretty vague. I'd much rather have a separate discussion and come up with something we think would work.
Councillor Belford?
I'd be happy to defer that to the next meeting, hearing what the Chief Executive has to say about the kind of guinea pig issue that we're going to discuss Wednesday.
Right, so we've got the three recommendations with that slight attachment to item 2. I've moved that. You've seconded, Councillor Barker. Are there any other views on that? Any other discussion? Councillor Hewitt, you were considering a comment.
Okay, I had acknowledged Sue earlier, and I'd like to acknowledge the report that Christina has done in particular, and a very thorough presentation. And I just note that a lot of the actions that are coming out of her paper are actually in, for instance, already been trialled in the Tuki catchment. So there were a couple of hotspot areas, and there's been community working group zone committees that are working on those, and I think that the local ownership approach with the in-house support has been hugely successful. I'm referring to Papanui. That program is now expanding into Matariki, Makaratu. Anyway, another one of the catchments down there, and all feedback from the community. And I'm talking about the whole community because there are a range of stakeholders that are in these small group meetings. Has been incredibly positive, and the team down there have been very much enjoying working with Warwick Hesketh. The locals, one of the bullet points that concerned me in the appendix particularly was too much emphasis is given to the economy, and I think that's a very dangerous slant to be taking, because we, as we all know around this table, are responsible for economic outcomes as well as environmental outcomes, and in order to achieve those environmental gains we need to be having the economic balance sheets to be delivering on expectations. So I just like a wider appreciation of what we're facing here in the rural sector, because at the end of the day, that's where the pain is coming and the payment's coming from, and people have to be able to afford it. So just once again, acknowledgement to the ladies and the team. You've brought together a huge amount of work under some quite interesting time constraints, and I really enjoyed the papers and the presentations this morning, so thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hewitt. There being no other... Oh, gosh.
I'll just say briefly, could I just say that I think it's worthwhile mentioning this council gets from time to time reports. We've had legal opinions and so on, which I thought weren't worth the paper they're written on. And I'm pleased to say that both these reports, in my view, are worthy and a good quality, and have added considerably to the debate. And I want to thank both Sue and Christina for that, and I think we'll be better off for the quality of their input.
Well said, Councillor Barker. Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm liking this report, but I'd just like to make a comment in response to Councillor Hewitt, where she talked about placing an emphasis on the economy. Without an economy, we don't have the ability to look after our environment. I would put it the exact opposite way around, and so unless we have a clean environment, we don't have an economy at all, because without the clean environment, we have nothing to sell.
Thank you, Councillor Bailey. There being no other comments, I'd like to put the recommendations. All those in favour? All those against? Carried. Councillors, we've got a plethora of speakers lining up one after the other and I see Chris is here as well, so we are running substantially behind. Can I bring up the tourism folk to the table and welcome George? Great to see you here. Now, we've Annie as well, of course. She's the regular feature, so it doesn't even need introduction. Look, Annie, I hope you can appreciate some of the time pressures we're under this morning. We've seemed to land it ourselves with the biggest agenda since Ben Hur. Can I ask that, and councillors expressed earlier their satisfaction with your report, and particularly the economic analysis can be taken as read. The councillors have been all over it with a fine-tooth comb, and we'd just like you to essentially summarise your position, and particularly would be interested to see the options, the alternative funding options that you're proposing in the advent of the long-term plan. Thank you. George, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora tātou, nei rata bihi, kua hui mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Chair, for giving us the time to talk to you. Yes, we have been briefed to be brief. We have a summary of the presentation that's just been handed around to you, but we've actually summarised the summary again, so we'll try and get through it as quickly as we can. Just perhaps to kick things off, when we first set up Hawke's Bay Tourism, we set the role that tourism in Hawke's Bay is a vibrant and valued contributor to the region's economy. I'd just like to highlight the fact that was 7 years ago. So what we clearly have is an overnight success. Look, the sole reason for anybody being involved in encouraging visitors to come to their region is the economic impact that it makes. It's not for any other reason at all. This is directly linked to the goals of Matariki, but just highlighting that some people, I think, look at the tourism industry, and because those in it tend to enjoy it. It's not about our enjoyment, it's about the fact that this industry, whilst it is a leisure industry, contributes significantly to the economy of regions and in New Zealand. So just a couple of quick things before we throw it over to debate, and Annie will go through that.
Yeah, so thank you, Chair, and we'll just quickly touch on a couple of things, and then we're going to talk about the funding scenarios. Just in terms of the funding, oh, there we go, hang on. I suppose there's been a huge amount of activity, and you all know that what we've done, and I think you've obviously been reading in the press what's been happening lately. So I guess one of the key things, though, that we have and did want to touch on today is around the regional digital proposition, which has brought all of the region together under one regional website, hawkesbaynz.com. What that has done is we've created this amazing bit of kit around it called the Hawke's Bay playlist. And this, we've had over 1,000 of these created already in the short time that the site's been live, which is about a month. Now what this does is obviously, in terms of funding, it has become a mechanism for us to generate funds from those that aren't necessarily in the tourism sector directly. So everybody who lists on the site has to pay, and we've actually, a very large portion of those who've already listed would never have given us a dime previously. So the site in itself is becoming, it's not going to cover all of our funding from the regional council, but it's a start to get more of those players that sit on the fringe of tourism into funding parts of what we do.
So in terms of the impact, and these are some of the numbers, and I won't go into them too much, other than really highlighting the fact that we are now an industry of 6,200 jobs, and critically, 880 of those jobs are new jobs in the last 2.5 years. So it's a key goal of Matariki, and it is a fairly important piece of the tourism sector. About 550 of those jobs are in the hospitality and accommodation sector. And so, yep, the numbers look good, but that is because we have been spending money to have a consistent approach to marketing the region for the last 2.5 years across each season. The other really important thing with visitor spend, and when we talk about where we extract money from to pay for tourism, 66% of spend actually goes to non-tourism businesses. So it's the supermarkets, it's the souvenir shops, it's fuel, it's pharmacies, it's those businesses, the electricians, the plumbers, the builders, those byproducts, those businesses that sit on the fringe. And so when extracting tax, and this is one of the issues that Auckland's facing currently, is that the current visitor taxing model in Auckland is only actually asking hotels to contribute to that, people staying in hotels. So it's certainly not capturing the wider tourism visitor economy, if you will. So in terms of investment, and I know we often get asked about what the local government, the other TLAs contribute in Hawke's Bay, and it is it's sizable, and there's a lot of examples listed in the paper. But in essence, and very conservatively, we've estimated between $5 and $8 million is spent currently, which goes to support all of the work we do. So our job, as we've always said before, is we catch them and the TLAs skin them. And it's really important that we have the facilities like iSites and increasingly freedom camping sites, events to drive people to come here and spend new money in our economy. The cycleways are also part of that, which the Regional Council has obviously invested heavily in. You know, it does help from an environmental point of view. We need to have clean water not only for our locals but for our visitors as well, and that's deeply important and a big part of obviously what the TLAs and you also do. But what's not included here is the future growth, and where you know, we look at the aquarium project. You know, Napier will be putting in $7 million to that. The sports park Splash Ban at the Opera House in Hastings, and the money needed to obviously support Wairoa and Rocket Lab in their quest as well. So all of that funding is not obviously included in obviously any of the work we do. We're there to promote those things that those local government initiatives create. Just in terms of private sector funding, and we have a very, very generous private sector in terms of Air New Zealand and particularly Jetstar. Jetstar came here because off the back of visitor growth, and what that's driven is 37% increase in passenger numbers, cheaper fares, and more connectivity for not only visitors but for all of us to get out of the region as well. You see some detail on new properties and obviously hospitality businesses and new jobs. We're nearly there. These are just some of the new businesses that have been created, and then this is where we're heading. George, do you want to quickly nip into that one?
Yeah, when we first talked to this council about increasing the funding, we did it on the basis of what we wanted to achieve in terms of visitor spend, and that has been achieved. So what this graph here shows you, in a sense, what your options could be. Now, the bottom line is total annual spend, $600,000. Let's say there was 600 million rather. If we weren't funded to do the job we want to do, things wouldn't go backwards. Let's just say that would flat line for a while anyway. But the top line is the growth path we're on now. And the difference between the two in 3 years' time is over $200 million. So that's the opportunity that exists from the tourism industry if we get it right. And clearly, what we're saying is we don't want to lose that opportunity. If you extend it out even further, when that's taking it out through the 10 years of the long-term plan, the difference is $1 billion. So it's quite extraordinary what tourism can do for this region and its people economically over the next little while. And what we're saying is, I know we're going to talk about funding, we're talking about an additional $900,000 a year. Over the course of the next 3 years, it's 2.7 million. the net returns are as much as 200. So it's not a bad return. Now, I understand the pressures that exist on this council, and that's what we're here to talk about. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that actually there's a pretty good opportunity here. And so now just turning to what happens when we start to look at what the cost per ratepayer is to funding the tourism model. Here's an example of what happens around New Zealand. Now, these are 216 figures. And as you see, you look down there, and let's take the council funding divided by rateable property. It was $18. We've updated this because of the last funding tranche. It's now 26. Those other figures will be much higher too. And as you can see, they're all substantially higher on a per property basis funding tourism than what we are. So it's not a bad investment that the regional council is making. And also, if you look at it on a per capita basis, it's $11. It's not a lot. The other thing I'd just add before we close is we have spoken to all of the other local authorities prior to coming here, just to check in, to say, look, are you happy with the current model? Because it's predicated on the basis that they won't rate for tourism and the regional council will. And they've all said yes. They've said, look, at the start this was a rockier road. They're satisfied that the work that's being done, they agree entirely that it's the most efficient model in terms of how you might want to fund regional tourism. I think the other thing that's come through here quite solidly, councillors, is there's an understanding now of the value of the region. In tourism you say country first, region second, product third, and that's starting to work really positively for Hawke's Bay tourism, or Hawke's Bay region. So that's where we sit today. We understand, I say again, is that the challenges you have, but this is an economic development rate. We believe it's attributing, or it's delivering exactly what it was designed to do. So thank you very much, Chairman, and that's the end of the presentation.
Great. Thanks, George, and thanks for your brevity. I think you covered a lot of territory very quickly. But it isn't premised on the basis that Annie is a master of getting information in front of us, and we're highly informed about the progress of Tourism Hawke's Bay, which has been excellent. Are there any questions or comments? Tom, Councillor Belford.
I guess I'm wondering, is there more? I mean, I expected you to come and talk to us about funding alternatives.
Well, they're in the paper, Councillor Belford, in terms of the options, but I mean, we can go ahead and cost some of those options, but there are many, and we're not quite sure that that is the most appropriate thing to do.
Well, it seems to me that signals have been sent for months now that continuation of funding as is problematic. And you've given us 2 pages out of a volume of economic analysis here that actually talk about funding options. You're the expert in this area. You know about bed taxes and various things that people are doing, trying, et cetera. And it would seem to me that either we can go out and research those issues and come up with an alternative if we need one, or you could provide us some of your advice as to what you think some better alternatives might be. So you either are opting into the conversation or you're opting out of it.
I think the answer to that is we want to opt into the conversation, but what we are saying quite strongly is the current model is probably the most efficient in New Zealand. The alternatives are basically a program of some form of taxation or levy on either various parts of the industry or on individuals as they come to and from the region. All of those are expensive to maintain and are sort of disproportionate in the way they might be applied. The current funding at about $11 a head is probably the most efficient and simplest process to fund a tourism promotional agency. If it's the regional council's firm desire that wants to find that money from somewhere else, then clearly we would work on that. But there aren't very many good models. There's the Auckland model, which the tourism industry nationally is saying that's not the sort of thing we want to engage in region by region or council by council. It was done by Auckland. They're big enough to get away with it. Other people aren't. And there's generally a feeling that they don't want to follow that model. There is a strong pressure that the government should take a leadership in helping the regions fund this, and we support that. I think local government New Zealand has a key role to play in this, because it's not just this council that's asking the question, it's all councils that are asking that question. But if you're asking us to come up with a magical alternative, there isn't one. It's just hard to do it another way. This is the simplest model you can probably get within New Zealand. And walking
The area of activity that this council funds, where the simplest model isn't for us to reach into our ratepayers' pockets and say, pay for it. More complicated ones have to do with user pay, et cetera, and it's our obligation to figure those out.
Councillor Wilson.
Just interested in the, because we've got to be very clear what we're funding here and what we're getting, and that is a coordinated approach to selling Hawke's Bay's experiences to others, both nationally and internationally. And we're not exporting apples here. We're exporting experiences, but actually the consumer's got to come here to partake in that experience, and that's the role of Hawke's Bay Tourism. When they get here, there's a whole range of other players, obviously including the TLAs, and we see they spend a fortune, but not so much to get them here. And we're competing in a national space for what is quite contestable money from people that have opportunity, different options, different places to go. So I think we need to be quite clear what we're talking about here. But my question quite simply is, the TLAs, when this first started, and I mean Councillor Curtin can, he had first-hand knowledge of some of this stuff, that was a very, very convoluted and ungainly conversation, because people were concerned about, or councils were concerned that we were perhaps stepping in on their space. I remember Splash Planet had a $90,000 program for Auckland advertising, just cutting across what the region was spending on its own program independently. How are we looking now? I mean, what are they spending their money on now? I don't really care how much they're spending, because they're spending on infrastructure and outcomes in their own patch, and good on them, that's what they're there to do. But what's the behaviours like now? I mean, are we finding conflict in every turn like we used to, or is everyone comfortable in their own skin now, and we actually got a system that works particularly well for Hawke's Bay, and the figures are reflecting that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is working a hell of a lot better, and it's taken time. Obviously, people change and staff movements, but actually the model at the moment, it's great. We have a very good collective approach to things. The website is an example, a really good example of that. So all councils are feeding through that site and providing information and content and so on. From a marketing point of view, we meet a lot to discuss the campaign work, but also in the event space. Everyone's playing fairly, and obviously the aim is, if it's an event that drives visitors to the region, it's a regional approach, but obviously each council also still has their own, local, mandatories that they need to perform. But yeah, it is working very well.
And would you agree that nationally, because we are a regional leader in this, we're showing incredible leadership as a council and a region, that we are beating others that aren't quite so coordinated?
I think there's definitely that. I mean, we won this very large tourism conference last week, which is a huge boost for our industry for in August, which is our quietest month. We're now seeing that as the national, we've been recognised as, they're coming to Hawke's Bay, haven't been here for 13 years, to see our product and see all of those experiences that you talk about, and they are the people that are selling us internationally. So that's just one small win, but yeah, we do have a voice on a national scale.
I think the critical thing there, and you've raised it, and that is, to get the economic benefit, you've got to motivate someone to come here first. They don't, to quote Shane Jones, get off the couch and come here, we get nothing from it. So we need something outside of the boundaries of the region that promotes the region. And what we've been able to do with this increase in funding is do that all year for the first time, and that's why we're seeing those results. And I'll just highlight a fact that, Councillor Belford made about asking people to dip into their pockets. We're actually not asking them to dip into their pockets any more than they have over the last 3 years. We're not asking for more here. We just want to carry on. So, thank you.
Thank you, George. Councillor Bevan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure everybody that's been sitting around this table for the last, 4 or 5 years has been very impressed with the work that you've done heading up Hawke's Bay Tourism, and I've no doubt that our money is well spent. There are two issues in my mind about all of this. The first is the council picking winners. There are a number of other major employment industries in this region which we do nothing to support, and I come from one of them. And I could create an equally coherent argument about us throwing more money at Pipfruit New Zealand, for instance, which would generate just as many jobs, or at the wine industry. So there's some real problems about the way, in my mind, that we've done this. And the other thing I've got some problems with is the fact that there's a lot of money in the tourism industry that's going to people that you currently can't really access because it's private accommodation. And you mentioned it in this paper about the possibility of a bed tax and the fact that Airbnb has been approached and might be willing to assist. So my question is, how many nights of accommodation, of private accommodation, are there in Hawke's Bay? Do you have some stats on that? And what about the other websites that provide an equivalent service? Would they be prepared to participate as well?
So the private accommodation that we estimate is about 65 to 70% of people stay in some form of private accommodation. So whether that's an Airbnb or with friends and family. So it's very, very high. There are about 400 Airbnb properties listed. Not all of those operate year round. They're kind of one-off, many of them for mission and particular events, but there are a sizable number. A lot of them are also listed on multiple sites, so holiday homes or book a batch, etc. Airbnb operate levies and taxes in various cities around the world, so it's not an impossibility. It is being proposed in Queenstown currently, so it's certainly a conversation that's being had. I suppose with any tax and levy, we are a small region and a very big, there's 30 odd regional tourism organisations. We just want to ensure that the conversation's had at a national level so that we don't end up in a country where you visit every single region and there's a different rating policy or taxing levy. So there is a lot of debate. This new government has also proposed some new ideas and initiatives around visitor levies or border taxes. And so, but obviously they've only been in power for a very short amount of time. So the conversation is really just starting to be ratcheted up. And so we want to be part of that conversation, but we don't want to sit in isolation and provide a solution for Hawke's Bay that's on its own without consideration of perhaps what's going on and monitoring a bit of the Auckland situation as well as Queenstown.
So just going back to the original question, number of nights?
We sit at about 4.2 million. There would be about 3 million of those nights would be in private stays, conservatively.
So even if we charged $1 a night, we could double the spend?
Yep. It's just how you monitor that.
It's how you set up the system that captures it. And obviously Auckland is the first cab off the rank. And we're quite happy to work with the council on that process, but what we're saying is that you can't do that overnight. There will be a national discussion about this undoubtedly, and it's just a bit early in the current government's term to determine where that will go, but it's certainly being talked about a lot. So it's probably, is it 1 or 2 years out before anything actually happens in this space? In the meantime, we've got to keep on going.
Supplementary chair, is that not being challenged though at the moment, that decision?
The Auckland decision?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're looking at extending it. So at the moment it's only on hotels. They've excluded motels and the rest, but they are looking at the rest.
But haven't the hotels taken it to court? They're challenging the decision?
They are challenging it, but it is in play. They are collecting.
Okay.
I've got 3 questions around the table. I just wanted to come to the Chief Executive. James, can you ask that? Mike, Tom?
Thanks, Chair. Look, I had a quick one. You noted in your alternative funding scenarios a report done for RTONZ in 2010, and that recommended that commercial businesses contribute more. And I think what was recommended there is that perhaps 75% with only 25% from residential. Now here in Hawke's Bay, we've got the absolute inverse. Have you got any sense of the reaction we would see from the commercial industrial sector if we did flip our current model the other way? Because you're saying here 66% of the spend goes to non-tourism. We've got hundreds of millions of dollars theoretically being generated for the commercial and industrial, particularly the commercial sector, and yet the residential sector is paying the
lion's share of
majority.
it, yeah.
So any sense of that?
We haven't spoken to them, but I, when you start to address and show people the value of what it is bringing, I think the argument's pretty clear. So, but we haven't had a detailed conversation around that.
Any, Mike, Mr. Mohi?
Yes, so I suppose the question would be, or some people would be saying, the spectacular growth in tourism over the last 2 or 3 years with the extra funding, would it have happened anyway? And like I know in Central Hawke's Bay, it was virtually no tourism 3 or 4 years ago. It's just the growth in the last 2 or 3 years in particular has been quite spectacular. And a lot of the people, and just me talking to them, it's suddenly they know about it, whereas before they didn't know. And that's, I think, a plus with that extra funding.
Much of a question in that, but
I think CHB's been a really good example of.
Did you realise?
We did, but there's about $5 million extra international spend going into Central Hawke's Bay as a direct consequence of that already, so, and growing. So.
you, Councillor Belford, I think might be the, and Councillor Bailey. So we'll go with you, Councillor.
On the one hand, Hawke's Bay Tourism is a creature of the council, and on the other hand, you're a player in a national industry, which creates a bit of perhaps a conflict of interest. And I guess if we're going to explore other funding avenues, including ways to grab online bookings, for example, only 3 or so players in that arena that would capture probably 90% of the bookings. But anyway, one example. But your position, it seems to me that we ought to make sure that we are in sync here in terms of what your advocacy position is in terms of national policy. That we as a council have an interest in looking at some options that, as you say, are best applied, if they're going to be applied, at a national level, applied consistently, and so forth. So I would personally hate to wake up and find that Hawke's Bay Tourism was, let's say, opposing a bed tax when our council felt like a bed tax is a prudent thing to be looking into, or an online service that captures a bit, as Peter says, a booking is something our council is interested in, but Hawke's Bay Tourism is taking the view that now we don't want to, we don't want to have that discussion nationally. So I am concerned that we be in sync here. You are our agent in a way, and if we are going to look at things that ought to be part of a national solution, we need to be on the same page, it seems to me.
Can I assure you we are, and we've had that debate a lot. In fact, publicly I questioned the previous Deputy PM here about the issue that we are all, as regional tourism organisations, under funding pressure because of the pressure on our funders, being regional councils. And we were concerned that the government did not appear to be taking a leadership role in helping us solve that. They'd allow Auckland to go off on their own, and the other councils are now having to look around, as we are right now, saying, what's the model we can use here? No one can find a good one. And so let's have a mature debate about where this is going, because it can't carry on. All regional tourism organisations are facing the challenges that we're facing. So, but I can assure this council that we are not taking a different position. We're passing on the very issue. We are under funding threat. We recognise that. What we're trying to do here, obviously, is share our views on the best way to deal with that. And right now, we've got a pretty efficient model, which you're saying is causing you some difficulty. Some of the alternative funding models might cause more. That's all we're saying. But we'll work with you on any solution you come up with.
Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not entirely sure who this particular question's for, but whenever I apply for funding to anyone, to an organisation, I'm applying for funds for something on behalf of an organisation, I tend to have to prepare a budget or a cash flow forecast or something and put that in with part of the application. I haven't. Is there one for Tourism Hawke's Bay, or so that we know what this money's actually going to be spent on, or are we just...
Yeah, there's a full 3-year funding agreement that's been in place, and we'll redo the funding agreement based on the next. This was just a funding paper for this particular meeting. But
Yep. Whereabouts can I find that?
the funding agreement?
Yeah.
We have a copy, the Regional Council has a copy.
Thank you.
You,
Was that a request?
Councillor Barker.
Just two ticks make it all. I think what we're dancing around here is the challenge that this tourism is one of the few activities this council does where it raises money off ratepayers using its statutory powers, forces money out of people's pockets to give to a particular sector for their benefit. This is what happens. We don't do this for the apple industry, we don't do this for others. In some places what we do is we want for their benefit, we target the rate so they pay for it directly themselves for stop banks and so on. And what we're seeing is a substantial growth in the tourism sector, and we see that the burden is still going to fall on the ratepayer as a whole. Apple picker and flaxmere paying for it, and you might argue that they get a benefit indirectly, but it would be a long bow, in my view. The people who are getting the benefit directly are the coffee shops and the motels and the hotels across the region, doing very well. So I guess what we're asking for you is, how do we get the people who are benefiting directly from this financially to make a significantly improved contribution to this ongoing cost? They are the beneficiaries.
But they're not the only beneficiary, and that's the problem.
Well, there is no problem. I don't see a problem.
I think, you know, we're an industry here made up of very small businesses. They do contribute, to us in terms of membership fees and funding and listing on websites and support. But they're also contributing, you know, $750,000 over 2 years to help promote and sell the region as well. So they are contributing. Back in the early days, 2011, we had a group of operators who contributed about $160,000 in addition each year for 3 years to make sure we were viable. You know, we can go out to the industry and ask them to do that again. That is an option, but I think it's not a long-term solution to have those levels of funding requests going to what is essentially a core group of players, a small group of players, the bigger ones. You know, I think we're not certainly against a visitor levy or a bed tax. That's not what we're saying. It's just we would like it to be looked at on a national level, so that from a visitor point of view, you're not tripping around New Zealand and asking, you know, in which city am I and what am I paying today and so on. Visitors are pretty used to paying, international visitors are pretty used to paying additional visitor levies and bed taxes in all cities of the world. But we would like it to be part of a national solution.
The issue you've raised, Councillor Barker, is, you know, why tourism? And it's a good one because it occurs at every level. Running the National Tourism Organisation, government kept asking, why should we fund this? We don't do it to any other industry. Around the world, it's exactly the same thing. Tourism is unique in the way it's funded. And the reason for that is that simply the sort of promotion that goes on simply wouldn't happen if it's left to the tourism industry. Because what happens, people will promote their product. And you'll find the tourism industry here will promote motels, they'll promote various elements of it, but they'll never promote the region or the town or the community. And it does impact on the apple picker because it provides the fact that there are cafes and laundries and the sorts of facilities that it supports. There's $600 million coming in through visitors to this community. So it has a very wide impact. But people don't see it. It just disappears, and that's part of the problem, is trying to for people to understand that they benefit from tourism in their daily lives. The reason the shops are open is tourism. The reason this place is busting today is there's a cruise liner, and you can just see the money from this morning, 7:30 in the morning, they're lining up and they're spending it in this town. That's economic impact, that it impacts on somebody who's sitting in the apple picking environment or wherever you like it. But wherever you go worldwide, tourism is funded through a mix of those reasons, and the reason for that is you won't promote your region in any other way. That's been the history of it for years. So, and we always have to justify it somehow.
All right, sorry, Councillor, but we are needing to move on. Councillor Hewitt, did you want a final question?
Yes, did you realise? I'd just like to thank you guys, and just to point out that with the apple picker in Flaxmere, for instance, so we employed working holiday visa people for quite some time through the tourism sector, obviously, but Hawke's Bay was a trendy place for them to come to, and they'd come here for a few weeks, and they added a great depth to our business that we were struggling because we didn't fit into the RSE cap. So I'd just like to acknowledge what you're saying around those the tourism on the less and ability to pay people.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson was going to move. And we've got a seconder with Councillor Bevan. Are there any other dying issues that you're wanting to have tabled?
Well, as mover, I'd like to speak, Chair. That's appropriate. Very briefly, I mean, this is the first time that this has had this. This is the first discussion publicly, I guess, around this issue that is going to continue through the LTP. And I just want to put a little flavour on the beneficiaries of this stuff. So, Wairoa, use it as an example, we can't afford to tell everyone what a great place we are as a community. We struggle. And yet we've got one of the great walks, we've got Mahi Beach, we've got a whole lot of exposure through Hawke's Bay tourism that is now starting to flow into other things happening in the area. For example, the Blue Bay Motor Camp, whether you agreed with the sale or not, and the change from a motor camp to what it is now, they've finally sold all the sections. Part of the interest is around exposure of the great place that Mahi Beach is to the rest of the country. Now, I'm not saying Hawke's Bay Tourism did that specifically, and I guess if you asked those people that have moved there and bought sections and invested in our part of the world, where they heard about it, they probably aren't too sure. The only thing I'd say, though, is the ongoing success and focus of Hawke's Bay through entities such as Hawke's Bay Tourism has resulted in, for example, first time in my adult life, I've got a choice of 5 or 6 plumbers in my town now. Right? There's a building boom going on out there like you wouldn't believe. There's builders everywhere. There's Sparkies. There's a whole range of benefits to me as an individual up there that I didn't have before through economic growth. Tourism's about investment in an area at the end of the day. Whether we're trying to dumb it down to it's just a few people spending a few bucks, but actually the Masonic Hotel, when they upgraded that, they spent something like $250,000. There was a whole range of tradesmen employed to do something on the back of tourism. So it's not as simple as we're going to be, we should be putting our money into apples or wineries or whatever, because unfortunately they can export, or fortunately they can export their product. For us to export tourism, we've got to import the person directly. They come and invest, businesses invest on the back of that. It's a unique proposition. I think it's not broken. I'm quite happy to support it as it is today.
Well said, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Bevan.
Very briefly, Chair, because I'm aware that time is moving rapidly on. I want to thank the two of you for coming in. As ever, it's a pleasure to have you here. I congratulate you on the work you've done on behalf of our region over a long period of time, and you make some very interesting and cogent points around how important it is to advertise a destination as opposed to a business if you wish to be successful. And I agree with all of that. Our problem is that in our long-term plan currently we've got a $3 million hole, so we have to make priorities, and we need to explore other ways to fund your very important work. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers? No other speakers? So we've got do you want to reply, Councillor? We've got the recommendation that the committee receives and notes the Hawke's Bay Tourism Future Funding Scenario Report, All those in favour of that recommendation? Aye. All those against? Carried. Look, thank you very much to the both of you. You're staunch and robust advocates for the sector, and you certainly do the sector proud, so we certainly appreciate that. And all the very best for Christmas and the New Year, George. We'll look forward to seeing you, no doubt, in the New Year. So thank you, and thank you, Annie.
No, thank you. Merry Christmas,
Could I just
everybody.
express on behalf of us, now that we've got through all that, we have thoroughly appreciated the support we've received from this council over the last 7 years. We couldn't have done it without you. I remember at the time when it was presented to us, I said our aim is not to let you down. I hope we haven't. We think that's been the motivational factor behind it, but we do appreciate your difficult job, but your support for us has been unfailing, so thank you.
I'm happy for certainly for item number 10 because that's one Rob got the most interest in. There's some to go through to the full council. I'm happy for item 10, which is the one I've got the most interest in to go through. Yep.
I had some questions on number 9.
Number 9, you've got some questions.
Chair, did I hear you say that Chris Tremaine was here? Or? Oh, well, whatever happens, I think we've got to go into public excluded now and come back to the others.
Sure. So you want to come back to them? Apologies. Yeah, so we've got a mover to
I'll
go into public excluded.
And
Councillor
that
Barker.
the meeting be attended by, we'll have to list the names.
That's
of
right, we
people.
will do too. So we've
Acebrook, you'll have to put them all down on the list.
that's right. So we've got a seconder for that, and then we'll list those attendees. So Councillor Bevan is seconding that we go into public excluded, and we've just had the benefit of an august group of people that need listing for this purpose, so that they can be included in the public excluded. Have we got there? All the names are there of the people that are going to come public excluded. So we've got all those in favour, thank you. We're now in public